Assalamualaikum and a very good day I wish to my lecturer and our fellow friends. So, me and my group will be presenting about the Old English period. So I will be talking um, a few part of the Old English period. After that, I will be giving the presentation to my group mate. So the Old English period um, in were divided into three parts, which is the first one Germanic settlement, second one Viking invasion, and the last one would be Norman invasion. So let me talk about the first one, which is the Germanic settlement. Before that, let me explain a bit about Old English. The Old English language, which is also called Anglo-Saxon, which is a language spoken and written in England before 1100. It is the ancestor of Middle English and Modern English. Scholars place Old English in the Anglo-Frisian group of West Germanic languages. So, this is what we have summarized for Germanic settlement. Latin had little influence because it was only used as a formal language even before the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century. Hence, only a few Latin words were adopted. Old English borrowed many useful German words because they contain simpler and more useful everyday words than Latin during the Germanic settlement. The diverse origins of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms established throughout Britain were reflected in Old English. The Scandinavian Vikings who conquered parts of Britain during the time had a significant influence on Old English, resulting in much lexical borrowing and grammatical simplification. For example, man, which have two n, simplified into man. Old English, which use daughter, is what we call daughter, and child is now child. Okay, let me break down more of this in this presentation. So, Old English, which is the earliest form of the English language, was spoken and written in Anglo-Saxon Britain from 450 until 1150. Thus, it continued to be used for some decades after the Norman conquest of 1066. English vocabulary has never been purely Anglo-Saxon, not even in the Anglo-Saxon period. By the time the Anglo-Saxons arrived in Britain, there had already been 4 centuries of linguistic interchange between Germanic and Roman people of the European mainland. Latin words might have arrived in English through any of several possible routes. To begin with, they must have entered the Celtic speech of the Britons during the Roman occupation, which is 43 to 410. And some might have remained in daily use after the Romans finally left in the early 5th century, so that they were picked up by the Anglo-Saxons in due course. Aristocratic Britons may also have continued to use the language as a medium of upper-class communication. If so, we might expect a significant number of Latin words to have been in daily use, some of which would have eventually been assimilated into English. Some Latin words would also have been brought in by the Anglo-Saxons invaders And following the arrival of St. Augustine in 597, the influence of the monks must have grown, with Latinisms being dropped into speech much as they still are today. Continuing on, the Latin words express a considerable semantic range. They include words for plants and animals, such as pea, cat, food and drink, butter and wine, household objects, cup, candle, metals such as copper, items of clothing, which is belt, sock, and many more. Most are nouns such as camp, street, and monk, with a sprinkling of verbs and adjectives. As we move into the period of early Anglo-Saxon settlement in England, we find these semantic areas continuing to expand with the growing influence of missionary activity reflected in an increase in words to do with religion and learning. Lastly, borrowing Latin words was not the only way in which the missionaries engaged with this task. Rather more important, in fact, were other linguistic techniques. One method was to take a Germanic word and adapt its meaning so that it expressed the sense of a Latin word. An example is ghast, originally demon or evil spirit, which came to mean soul or Holy Ghost. Another technique, relying on a type of word creation which permeates Old English poetry, was to create new compound words, in this case by translating the elements of a Latin word into Germanic equivalents. So, Liber Evangelii became Gottspelbuch, which means Gospel book, and Trinitas became Trines, which is from Trines become Trinity. So that's all for the Germanic settlement, and continuing on to Viking invasion. So, because of the immigration from Scandinavia, the language the newcomers spoke had a big influence on the English language. It is vague whether the Danes or Norwegians who affected the English language the most, because the two languages are so similar. And of course, either the Danes or the Norwegians speak the same language as they did 1000 years ago in Scandinavia. The language the Vikings spoke was called Or Nordisk, or directly translated into English or Nordic, or as it mostly referred to, Or Norse. So, breaking this down more, we will look at what caused the Viking influence on the English language. So, there have been speculations for some time by the historians that there was an overpopulation problem in Scandinavia during the 9th and 10th century. Something like this could have led to a lack of fertile land, and therefore forced the leaders of their local societies to use an ancient custom to resolve this problem, which is the drawing of lots. This ancient custom was widespread in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, and this method of drawing lots to prevent famine in Scandinavia has been documented in books such as in the saga from Gotland, the Gutta Saga. The losers were forced to leave their homeland with all their belongings and were condemned to live abroad. They might have had no other option than to fight people on the British Isles to get a hold on some of that precious fertile land so they could feed their families. This is one of the many reasons why the Vikings started to raid the coast of the British Isle. But I do not think that this land grab only was done in the name of the axe, since there was huge areas in Britain that were uninhabited. Many towns in England was founded by the Vikings, and some of them still have their original names until this day. Because of the lack of land in Scandinavia during the 9th and 10th century, tens of thousands of people from Norway and Denmark crossed the sea and sailed to the British Isles to settle in England. It is estimated that from Denmark alone, 35,000 people immigrated to England. It might sound like a low, very low number, but at the time, it was around the same number of people who live in London. Because of the immigration of from Scandinavia, the language the newcomers spoke had a big influence on the English language. Um, Same as I said just now. But something is for certain, the Viking language is still very much alive in the British Isles, and many towns in English still has the Nordic word for town, which is the word by. For instance, which is the word, yeah, by. For instance, the town Helperby in northern Yorkshire originates from two Nordic words put together. Helper, which comes from the female name Hjalp, and the Nordic word for a town, which was by. There are many towns that were founded by the Vikings. In fact, the number is somewhere in the thousands, and that is just in England. But we have to keep in mind that we cannot be 100% certain which towns that were founded by the Vikings, since most places in England was not registered before the year 1086, when King William the Conqueror ordered that all the owners of all the land in England and parts of Wales had to be written down for taxation purpose. All this information was put together in what we would be known as the Domesday Book. But it was not just towns, roads, and places that have names that originate from the Vikings. As I said earlier, the English language has had a big influence on it from the Vikings. In fact, the words you use on daily basis when you speak English are full of Old Norse words. English words such as sister come from the word sister in Old Norse. The word for window comes from Vindauga, and even common words such as steak comes from the Old Norse word Vanta. There are many more words in the English language that originate from Old Norse. So, I made a short list below for you guys to check out. Yeah, just a bit. So, some of the words is ah, yeah, bag, which is baggy. Cake used to be called kaka. Child, vine, cloud, clover, die, which they say as daya, and egg, which is air or just simple egg. So that's all from me. My partner will continue on presenting about the Norman invasion. Please continue.
Assalamualaikum to Dr. Anelka and all of my classmates. So today I'll be presenting about the Norman invasion. So the Norman conquest strongly affected the language, and during the Middle English period, the English language was affected grammatically and in its vocabulary. So those in the grammar reduced from a highly inflected language to an extremely analytic one. So I will briefly explain the history on this. After the Norman invasion in year 1066, the English language changed dramatically. So 20 years after the battles of Hastings, all of the past Old English aristocracy has been taken out of any positions of power. So an article where Robert Bartlett described this as the swiftest and most thorough replacement of one ruling class to another in English history. So this change in ruling class would create the conditions possible for Norman English and the Old English to eventually mold into Middle English. And At this time, a lot of French literature was produced for royal and noble patronage. So, in the years following the Norman conquest, the sting of defeat and hardships were forgotten, and people accepted the new order as something accomplished, and they accepted it as a fact and adjusted themselves to it. So, when the Normans took charge in the year 1066, they brought with them with a completely unknown culture and language. So the number of Normans who settled in England was sufficiently predominant to continue to use their own language. And it was natural at first, but because they knew no English. But for 200 years after the Norman conquest, French still remained the language of ordinary throughout among the upper class in England. So, intermarriage and association with the ruling class, numerous people of English extraction thought it was an advantage to learn the new language. So, before long, this distinction between those who spoke French and those who spoke English was not ethnic but social. So, and then after the Normans take over as the ruling class, the Old English was discarded and by the aristocracy, and Latin or Norman French was substituted. So at this moment, French became the language used by merchants, the court, and was spoken by the ruling class. And Latin was also used in clergy, and those vocabulary involved in the loss of a large part of all English were stopped, and the addition of thousands of words from French and Latin. And the English language was only in use by the common folks. And by removing Old English from the ruling classes, the door for changing the primary language has been opened. And simplification has happened as the common people tried to communicate with those whose first language was not English, which is the Normans. And then at the beginning of this period, English is a language that is must be learned like a foreign language for a foreign tongue. And in the end, it is modern English. So as English was in the process of changing, vocabulary from French and Latin language were brought in. So the 13th century must be viewed as a period of shifting emphasis upon the two languages spoken in England. So the upper classes continued for the most part to speak French, but the reasons for doing so were not the same. Eventually, French became a cultivated tongue supported by the social custom and by businesses and administrative convention. Meanwhile, English made steady advances. When the separation of the English nobles from their interest in French has been completed, the English was becoming a matter of general use among the upper classes. And it is at this time that the adoption of French word into English language assumes large proportions. So these two stages can be observed, and in the year 1250, X has been dividing the line. So the borrowing of the first stage differ from those of the second, being less numerous and in being more likely to show peculiarities of Anglo-Norman phonology, and especially in the circumstances that brought about their introduction. And then when we study French words, it appearing in the English before the year 1250, and roughly we find them many were like for the lower classes, and eventually it will be more familiar for the contact with a French speaking nobility, such as barons, messenger, juggler, and more. And then, obviously, on their introduction to English to literary channels, the great single group amongst the word that came in early was associated with the church, where the necessity of transference from clergy to the people. So in the period after 1250, um, the conditions of the French words making their way into English were supplemented, and new and powerful factor, which is those who had been accustomed to speaking French were turning increasingly to use English. So the process of supplementing this new language instead of replacing old words expanded the vocabulary. So all of these changes would eventually lead to the language taking on the name of Middle English. So the idea of accepting new words from different languages would remain with the English language and would remain throughout the time until Middle English um, and until the English that we use today. So in general, we can say that in the earlier Middle English period, the French words introduced into the English were such as people speaking one language often learn from those speaking another. And in centuries and a half following the year 1250, when all classes were speaking and learning to speak English, there were also such words as people who has been accustomed to speaking French would carry over them and into the language of their adaptation. So that is why we see in the dictionary where we have the root word are from Latin and from French. So that is it from us from All English. Thank you so much.